Good afternoon and welcome back to the final session in our thematic cluster of Modernisms and Sexualities. In this session, we'll be having a conversation with all three of our speakers, Professor Gabriel, Professor Brinda, Bose and Professor Meena Pillai. The theme they've given us for this conversation is sexual dissidence in Indian literature in English, where I think you'll see them tying up everything that they've spoken about in their respective talks to the 2 days. So I now invite the three professors to occupy the chairs at the front and then we can take the conversation from there.
Okay, good afternoon everyone, and I think we're all in no mood for dissidence after so many sessions and that great lunch and the heat. But anyway, we shall soldier on. I think the idea is really now to have a discussion with all of you, not that we will hold forth, because we've already done some of that, and we'd like to be in a conversation together, so that would be good. And so we'll speak a little bit, each of us, to begin with, and then let's see, you want to take it up, or if you want to raise some more questions, or whatever you want to do. So Meena and Karen have asked me to set the ball rolling. So I was thinking last night that I thought we can start with some more general questions about sexual dissidence itself before we address or come to the question of Indian writing in English and this particular rubric. So you can all hear me, right? Yeah. So I wanted to flag a few questions that we can think about, even as we then apply them maybe to Indian writing in English. To start with, what does sexual dissidence signify? Because it's interesting that in general vocabulary, even while sexual dissidence is defined as any sexual action that defies taboos, right, on sexual behavior. So there are certain social and cultural, political taboos for certain kinds of sexual behavior, and dissidence actually tries to defy that and break that down and go beyond the boundaries that have been set on us by, just by expectation or by actual rules, or whatever the way that we are supposed to behave or not behave. But this is of course usually by a dominant social system of some kind, patriarchy, hierarchies, etc. But what it has ended up becoming is almost as shorthand for queer sexualities. Right? So sexual dissidence has begun to shrink in some sense into the idea of queer activism, queer sexualities as dissidence. So we can just think about it, not of course to restrict our discussion to queer studies, but to think why and how this might have happened, right? And what does that mean for sexuality, for thinking about sexualities in literature. And then another question, that what does sexual dissidence, whether it is actually inscribed, like if you're reading a novel, then it's actually there in the text, in the story, or in the language, etc., or even metaphorically, that it's signified in some way, right? That there's a gesture that gives us a sense of sexual dissidence. What does it do to and for a literary text when there is sexual dissidence inscribed in a text, whether it's actual or whether it's metaphorical? What does it do to that text? How do we then see that text? Then a third question leading from that: how does one inscribe or write sexual dissidence into a text? Are there ways other than explicit sexual content? Because we often say that oh yes, it's about sexuality and it's about sexual subversions or etc., but it doesn't actually have any explicit sexual content, right? Then there must be other ways of signifying sexual dissidence even without being explicit in a text, right? Also, that then there's a distinction made between those texts within texts that signify sexual dissidence, that there's a distinction made between those that do have explicit sexual content and those that don't have, right? Almost as if that even within the larger category we are creating a taboo for texts that have explicit sexual content, right? That if there's actually something, then okay, that is explicit. So why do we want to make this content taboo even in a category which is resisting this taboo? That's actually quite interesting to think about. And the fourth one, which I'm going to talk about a little bit more before I pass it on to Meena and Karen, what is the role of censorship in cases of sexual dissidence in text? We're actually thinking about representations of sexual dissidence, right? We're not thinking of acts of sexual dissidence, but we're thinking censorship has clearly played a large role in these cases. But I think it might be interesting to think about whether it represses dissidence, which it clearly does, that when it suddenly bans a book or a film or something, it is trying to stop the expression of sexual dissidence. But can it trigger dissidence? When there is censorship, can it actually elicit more dissidence than, because we've often heard that, that film was okay, it was not that great, but because it was banned, then people have come out on the streets, then they have, tried to burn down, and extreme situations, burn down cinema halls, etc., right? So can actually censorship have a counter effect on arousing a certain kind of dissidence, since the task of censorship is to suppress, right? So can it have the opposite effect of inspiring dissidence? And then to just follow up on this question of the role of censorship, we know that obscenity trials and bans of books and films that are said to violate norms of sexual representation, right, have been a marker of modern existence. From the 20th century onwards, we started having these bans, first in the Western world. I was talking earlier this morning about Chugtai and Manto's ban. So Chugtai's Lihaf, of course, we know that's, everybody knows that story, and we know, of course, also of Lady Chatterley's Lover, of Ulysses, of texts that have been banned on grounds of obscenity. So even as the world and humanity and readership has progressed on ideas of democracy and freedom, right? Freedom of expression has become a kind of catchword through the 20th century. It has also begun to set limits on what can be seen or heard or represented, said, that is outside the codes of civility. Right, so freedom and freedom of speech, freedom of behavior, of course, but freedom of speech and expression in the case of literature is encoded within certain codes of civility that we want to adhere to, and we expect others to adhere to. And it has often been said, Spivak has used this term and others, that reproductive heteronormativity, right, that this is really the gold standard for escaping censorship. And that is if you think about it, it's a very narrow ambit that you can actually play within, right? So because it's not just heterosexuality, it's heteronormativity, which also means institutions of marriage, institutions of certain age, expectations that you have to be an adult, both people have to be adults, etc., all kinds of things. So it really, the ambit becomes quite small. And all sort of gestures, ventures outside of that Lakshman Rekha, as it were, can actually be censored. And okay, so in literature in particular, there are 2 or 3 ways of censorship coming into play. One is the most obvious, the banning of the book by state machinery, right? That some way or the other, there's a court order, and the book is not supposed to be sold and circulated. So that's the most obvious one, and that usually triggers dissidence, right? Because we like to come out against the state, so we think that the state should not oppress us, so then we can whip up some kind of resistance to that. The next kind is social, cultural, political boycott of the book by the communities. Sometimes they can be in agreement with each other, or sometimes they can be just a smaller community of readers, of booksellers, of critics, of publishers, who intend to kill a book, right, or a film by, just criticizing it to death, by calling it out. Today we are in a culture of calling out and cancelling. So doing that to a text or a book, to a book or a film, and not allowing it to circulate, right? So then you call out a book or that, so that people don't buy it and read it, or a film, so that people don't go to see it. And the third kind, I've seen, this was quite an interesting discussion that I remember having being part of, or having heard, on the idea of self-censorship. When writers and readers themselves begin to censor what they are writing or reading, which is something that one imposes upon oneself, either because one wants to conform to codes of civility, you don't want to break out of the boundaries that are being set. You agree with them, either you agree with them, or we either we agree with them, or we decide that it's safer to stay within certain bounds of propriety, of civility, of whoever is wielding the power of saying that this is not acceptable, to accept that and to begin to censor oneself, right? That I will not read this, I will not watch this because it is not good, right? And also if I'm writing, if I'm a writer or if I'm a filmmaker, then I will not venture into those areas. So then to think about censorship, that do we have a way of hitting back against these social strictures, if we believe in freedom of expression, if we believe that desire is something that will always cross boundaries of civility and norms and heteronorms and all of that. Are there, is there kind of machinery that we go to that will then begin to flout regulations and bans? Are people conscious of the censorship of desiring in writing, since there's a general atmosphere of censorship around us, right? Sexual dissidence, or the censoring of sexual dissidence is only one area of many that are being censored now. There are so many aspects of life that are being censored. So are we conscious that the censorship of desire in writing in particular is something to fight back against in this general curbing of freedom? And is sexual dissidence bound to suffer, since the climate at large is now one of censorship and of moral safety? Because sexual dissidence is immoral, after all, right? Given by laws and by civil codes and a general sense of morality and ethics. So is this even sought anymore? Should we seek this anymore in life and literature if we believe in moral codes, right? So that's, I think, it becomes a paradox, and it becomes sometimes a contradiction, that we are fighting for freedom, we want people to have freedom of expression, but we also want that people don't cross certain boundaries, we want to be safe, we want others to be safe, but sexual dissidence is not safe, right? So it's something that we have to also level with ourselves, I think, before we think about larger kind of context. So state censorship, of course, is always with explicit sexual content. It finds it, I mean, whether it is true or not, like the court case against Lihaf, etc., that it finds certain sentences or certain instances in text, and then it brings a ban, and it says either you expunge these sections, and then the book or the film can be, films are always going through the censor board, right, and saying take this out, take that out, bleep this, etc., and then it will be passed. But bans have become much more prevalent lately, not only for Indian writing in English. In fact, I was trying to think that actually Indian writing in English, I'm not sure, but then maybe you all will talk about it also, that which are the actual texts that have been banned in recent times. But that was all translation, no?
No, Indian writing in English.
Oh, it was, okay. So Murugan's was translation.
Murugan's was
Perumal Murugan's book, interestingly enough, that was when it was in vernacular, it wasn't taken up. When it was published as a translation, one part woman, right? It then, of course, got into all those troubles, etc. So just these questions that I wanted to put out there, and then Karen and Meena will talk about, I think, literary texts and particular cases. But also, so to end up with that question, that if we do self-censor, or if we do recognize a censoring of the self, also because one wishes to support sexual morality and a prevalent culture of safety and calling out and cancelling, then why should one want to participate in or support sexual dissidence in writing or reading as in life? So unless one wants to see representations of sexual dissidence in literature as a moral science lesson, you see sexual dissidence and then you point it out to children or to students that, this is what one should not do, or this is where one should not go, right? So which then becomes a different kind of usefulness of sexual dissidence altogether. So I just wanted to put these, place these ideas out there, and then we can take this forward. We can have Meena and Karen talk, and then we'll open it up, and I'm sure you all will have lots of ideas and thoughts to share as well. Karen, do you want to go?
Meena?
Meena?
Should I go?
Yeah. Okay.
I take this.
Oh.
Thank you, Brinda. I think much of what I'm going to say is also connected with what you said. Indian writing in English is a much favored course in most of the English departments across the country, no doubt about it. But something happened recently which set me thinking. I was in the Board of Studies of a university, where we were discussing the course of a cultural studies paper. And I said, in the application, the praxis part, why don't we have a visit to the mall, a paper written on a shopping mall, so include a shopping mall. And I could see the moral panic writ large upon the faces of, the members of the the Board of Studies. There was so much of anxiety. In fact, somebody actually told me that, how can you do this? Are you saying that our students should go to malls? Are you saying that they should be studying malls? Where have we reached as a discipline? So this moral anxiety is something, that made me think a little bit more about this whole issue of pedagogy and dissidence, which I think is a very important aspect of what we are discussing today. So how do we talk about the canon and the whole process of canonization that happens with regard to Indian writing in English, as also the whole issue of pedagogy? How, for example, do we include texts that are written large with sexual dissidence? how do we select these texts? How are they included in the process, in the canon itself? In what I feel for the majority is should be in a non-threatening manner, right? It should not threaten, which I think is a very important point that we should consider when we look at this whole process of canonization itself. I think a history of bringing into the canon texts of sexual dissidence, in a sense, is also, within the academia, speaking truth to power. That is how I would call it. There is a certain element of that. Something that needs to be reflectively undertaken, to be dwelt upon ethically. Also because it is important to the cultural history as also the literary history that we are talking about. The historiography, the methodology of systems of thought and knowledge around sexuality in our country. I think also particularly because students as material subjects, who are in front of us, as material subjects who perform this history, it's important to address that. Do we actually correlate the two? Do we look at students as carrying this burden of the material history as also people with whom the text is interacting with as it is taught in class? So, I think this is so important because it could create new discursive formations. I think when I was thinking about this, one particular critic who drew my attention was Henry Giraud, who talked about a pedagogy of difference, which is so important to what we are talking today. A pedagogy of difference, which according to Giraud, seeks to, I quote him, seeks to understand how difference is constructed. How is difference constructed in the intersections of official canon of the school and the various voices of the students from subordinate groups? I think this is a very important aspect of what we are teaching. It also draws upon students' experience both as a narrative for agency and a referent for critique, both ways. It's something that I found extremely interesting. It also points to the importance of understanding in both pedagogical and political terms how subjectivities are produced within those social forms in which people move, but which they are often only partially conscious about. So I think this pedagogy of difference is something that we find lacking in our academic spaces, and it is this that should particularly come to bear upon our discussions around sexual dissidence. Many say, for example, that pedagogy of difference, as Brinda rightly pointed out, need not necessarily be all about where I would open up, the very maybe the boundaries of what cure implicates, and maybe think of it in the larger political context. It need not just be about lesbianism or gay or LGBTQIA. No, something more politically trenchant than all that. It's definitely there. So people often say that queerness has begun to leave the margins in India. My question is, has it in the academia? Has it really? Let's be truthful to ourselves. I see, for example, in Kerala where I teach, I see many students struggling to breathe all around me. All around me, there are students struggling to breathe. So, even when a text like A. Revati's, writing, or a poem by Merchant, or an essay by Ruth Vanitha, they might all be part of the canon. But the second question I want to raise, it's a more uneasy question, maybe because as a teacher myself, it creates a certain kind of an uneasiness in me, because the question is, how is it being taught? You might find all these texts, you might see that they've all become part of the canon, but how are they being taught is a question that unsettles many of us. So, do we really have a queer pedagogy that unsettles received binaries? Do we really have that? And the second point, the third point that I wanted to make is that we also need to push the disciplinary boundaries of what constitutes Indian writing in English. Of course, from day one I've been talking about regional literatures and translation, vernaculars and translation and all that. But something more important, I think, is also to begin to think about the question of form. Because I think the pedagogy of difference that I was talking about, it's very important that for us to take notice and take stock of the fact that much of the emergent new discourses can be found in online terrains, where people are opening up, where there are little voices, people speaking about their own experiences, maybe our own students, putting up Facebook posts, putting up blogs, being in blog spheres and talking about the burden of history that they carry. So should not that also be part of what we are teaching? Because I think these are very significant little histories that we have forgotten in this grand edifices that we have built around canons and the whole process of canonization. So I think these are voices, these are texts that ought to come in to our curriculum and be part and parcel of the way we talk about dissidence and the way we teach dissidence. So I also would like to maybe, when we open it up for discussion, I was also thinking about much of the kind of tensions which we often fail to see in our classrooms, the tensions and the defiances against heteronormative kinds of texts that we have taught. We tend to silence those tensions. We tend to pretend that we don't see those tensions or we don't see those silences. So there is a kind of a status quo, a kind of a moral anxiety and panic that guides much of our classroom practices, and I think we need to go back and revisit and reread our own literature that we teach, even from other aspects. We need to go back and put them into these kinds of unsettling, put them up or complicate them with these unsettling questions. So the main point that I want to raise is this issue of pedagogy of difference, as also some of the uneasy tensions that we have when we teach sexual dissidence in class. Thank you. We'll take it up after Karen.
Yeah. Thank you, Brinda and Meena. Well, you already, there's already so much out there that's been put out there. But I sort of want to begin with a question of what is really at stake in writing about sex. And, on the one hand, you have the question, of course, which pertains, in a sense, in some ways to what Meena was referring to, which is a certain set of pedagogical practices which pertain to how do you speak about it, in what terms do you speak about it, in what terms does it become okay, in a sense, to speak about it. What are the various boundaries that actually determine, or determined boundaries, which govern the ways in which what one can say, how one can say it, and why those particular boundaries have to be, or should be, or are maintained. So, you've got two main areas which tend to be, actually three main areas which tend to be sites of censorship. One is sex, the other is violence, and the third is politics. My question pertains to why the first must be violence. You can say, well, it is learned and so on and so forth, and it has X, Y, and Z consequences, and therefore it is so. In politics, of course, one realizes there is many stakes in a lot of that. So I'm going to just leave this as a question for the time being. What is at stake in writing about sex? On one hand, you do get a sense that what we have, by and large, is what Spivak has referred to and Brinda reminded us, heteronormative heterosexuality, and that is a sort of a privileged referent in sexual culture, and becomes, of course, the central paradigmatic sexual pattern that one refers to all the time. So either one, if one writes within the paradigm, then there is a whole set of institutions that get upheld, whether these are institutions of caste, endogamy, institutions of class and ethnicity, and divisions, stratifications get upheld. If you write against the grain, then you are likely to land in a whole lot of problems, whether this is interreligious, intercaste, and so on and so forth. So in writing about sex, one is actually writing very importantly about social stratifications in important ways. And in of course, a very intimate kind of way as well. The second thing that I want to open out for discussion, if it interests you, is there is one school of thought that believes that there is no need for a private space, that everything can and should be said. It's an interesting position to take, and there is the other side which says that, well, there has to be a separation of spaces. I think we can discuss that. But it does bring us to some very important issues. The first is the issue that pertains to privacy, which has come up in the context of censorship. Now, recently there was an attempt to ban pornography in India. Child pornography is banned worldwide. I don't know, in Philippines also it is banned. There is some sort of looseness about the way in which the law is applied, but it is actually not. It is worldwide, it is banned. That doesn't mean there is no child pornography or there is no trafficking and so on and so forth. Not to say that the trafficking and pornography are the same things, they are separate things. Now the interesting thing is that the state, when it stepped in to adjudicate on this question about whether or not there should be censorship, first of all, there was some ham-handed way in which porn sites were attempted to be shut down, and then they said shut down the site, then it was the URL, and so there was a lot of confusion in terms of technical terminology, and the service providers were confused. But the ban was lifted. Now, when the ban was lifted, one of the things that the court said is that it does not have business. This is not the business of the court to adjudicate on people's sexual behaviors, and their right to see what they do and they don't. And at a time now when these freedoms are being encroached on increasingly, I think it is very important to protect the right to be left alone by the state, and the right to be able to see, watch, and so on, whatever you want. On the other hand, so you have this set of arguments, and on the other hand, you have the understanding that there are certain, Brinda referred to a certain set of maybe public moralities or what have you, that are there in place already. What do we do with those? There are questions of safety, there are questions in the case of pornography, for instance, which is, by the way, an enormous industry in terms of not just the audiovisual, but in terms of your written pornography. Print pornography is a big industry. What do you do with that kind of material? Do you ban it? or is everybody, or do people have the right to, sort of look at and read what they want? Interestingly, the Indecent Representation of Women's Act did, at the time, a couple of decades ago, addressed the question and was of the opinion that certain representations of women are in some way disempowering to them. And there are certain representations of women, therefore, that should be banned. Now, here you find a very interesting kind of alliance forming between women on the right and women on the left. Because women on the left were of the opinion that there are disempowering images that should be banned, and women on the right historically have been in favor of banning of sexual imagery. So you have, the feminist problematic then of what you need to do about sexual speech, what you need to do about the representation of sexuality. There is the Santhali writer called Hamsta Savinder Shekhar, I don't know if any of you has read him, but his book My Father's Garden is in 3 acts, or 3 parts if you like, and the first part is sexually extremely explicit. And his earlier book was banned. This book is, received a lot of flack from people from the region and so on because of its explicitness. And other books of his that are explicit as well. And it appears then that the representation of sexuality is somehow demeaning, it is debasing, qualifies the subject of that representation in a very negative kind of way. There are 3 terms that normally occur together. One is obscenity, the other is eroticism, and the third is pornography. Just to pick up the first one, when you think about obscenity, one is really, or the word obscene breaks down as to disgust, or of disgust, and it actually suggests the physical revulsion that comes from something that is disgusting. So it does refer to a set of public morals that are in place. It does refer to a set of expectations and a certain social morality which, when violated, results in either a sense of disgust or a sense of revulsion for that object. Eroticism, on the other hand, is something that is very highly valued. But there's a very thin line, and this is something that we can discuss, between the erotic and the pornographic. It is not as easy a distinction as one thinks it is. It's not a matter of quantum, that is how much of sex there is, or sexual explicitness there is, or something like that, but it's a far more tenuous kind of distinction between obscenity and pornography, because what is obscenity in the 1990s is, pornographic in the 1990s is perfectly legitimate in 2000 and so on and so forth. So that's a kind of sliding scale that you have, and it's very difficult to make that, but we will try in the course of the discussion to come to some kind of, if you're interested, to come to an understanding of the distinction between the two. Now, I was thinking while Meena was speaking that if there is one set of representational practices that actually unsettles the received binaries, it really is pornography. It respects nothing, in the sense that it is, I don't know whether you would say politically correct, incorrect, I mean those terms in fact don't seem to even hold in the context of that, where every single difference, as they say, if you imagine it, it's already there. So every single possible permutation and combination is already available in a sense. But it is not just that it is already available, it is it is often monetized. It is not only available, but it is monetized. So we have then, obviously, we are thinking then of spaces. There is, there are departments that teach, that have, porn studies. There are some universities that will find it completely unthinkable to have something like that. I'm not sure whether we should or should not, but the fact of the matter is that it is the one domain where every possible binary is reinforced and also dismantled. So the sort of set of authors whom I thought would be interesting to, I don't know if you're familiar with some of them, but there's this, there are a few of these books that have come out recently which are actually working very interestingly with ways of speaking about sex. One is called A Handbook for My Lover by Rosalind de Mello, and I thought I would actually read something rather tame out to you. From the book, where she says, let me see if I can find it. Yes. She actually talks about erotica, and she says, erotica is not just being more subjective about sex and sexuality. It is also less caught up with the linearity of porn's focus on the orgasm and more preoccupied by the matters that surround sex, including the meanings of sex and sexuality. So we get a line like this. To strip, you must first wear your sins like clothes. To strip, you must contend with shame. You must learn to make too much of dust. To strip is to confess, to lay bare, to expose yourself to a pair of possibly unforgiving eyes. There is no beginning and no obvious end. Beneath the veneer of clothes is not just the naked body, but a universe of skin and scars, the memory of touch. I shall strip to my almost core, except etc., etc., is a bit explicit there. And the book proceeds to actually enact a striptease, and through it, various kinds of meditations on sex, sexuality, and eroticism. So, the last point I make, and then I think we can open it up, is, to complicate everything, real life, in a sense, sexuality and sexual behavior is, way ahead, in a sense, of the depictions of it, of the representations of it. It tends to be edgy, it's multi-layered, it's outside of conventional moral standards very often. When you think about heteronormativity and when you think about heterosexuality, you think about non-normative heterosexualities as well, and the n number of permutations and combinations and distinctions and experiments that go on within which destabilize heteronormativity all the time. So it can be really very radical in that sense. So I think that when I think about sexually dissident literature, it is not necessarily queer literature, but it is literature that, in a sense, challenges the everyday heteronorm. It's also something that you need to push the boundaries for. The problem with both writing and that is, when you come to self-censorship, who writes about sex and how? Why is it that women are so hesitant? And there are some women writers here Rosalind de Mello is one. There's Aranya Yani, who's writing very interesting things. There's Pia Kundu and Ruchir Joshi, who's edited a volume called Electric Feather. And all of this is, women undertaking to write about sex and sexuality in very many important ways. The question is, and I'll end with this, who is going to study it? Because the moment you start studying sexuality, you enter the domain of, really the taboo, which is where we started, our conversation in this panel. And there is an attempt to pornographize both and stigmatize actually, the researcher and the research both. So if you are going to be speaking about this, then you always run the risk of being stigmatized. If you're going to study it, then so much more, because universities and canons and academia are notoriously conventional. So where is the space? How is the space going to be created? I don't know. Brinda?
Yeah, and we can take a round of responses. I mean, need not even be responses to what we have said, but what you also think about the question of sexual dissidence at large, and of course, Indian writing, what we are studying or what you've read.
We would love to hear from the students.
Yeah, I know,
Yeah.
because that's where the buck stops finally in terms of who's going to read and who's going to study. Yes, there you are. Yes.
Good afternoon. So recently, Delhi University banned Master Devi's from its women's literature paper, which we had in our semester. And the reason that it provided was that, at least what I was told by the professor, is that it's obscene. So my question is that how does academia combat censorship of any sort when what is being censored is first of all not, or rather the reasons behind its censorship is largely vague, or largely vague and something not comprehensible as such, because how is it obscene? It can be obscene in many ways. And secondly, at what point do the reasons behind a text's censorship eclipse all other concerns surrounding that text?
I think if I can, I don't know whether this is an answer, but NCERT banned large sections of a textbook in Kerala which talked about the Marubarakal Samram, or the press cloth revolt. And so what you call censorship is also extremely political, right?
Yeah.
And obscenity itself is a political way of looking at things. The problem that, maybe after Karen was speaking, I was also thinking about this question of, doesn't academia have a pornographic gaze? It's not just about pornography as a category, but also the gaze that is within academia, where I was thinking of Lawrence saying that pornography is the mental of sexuality, or the mental that is imposed upon sexuality. So I think it's more of a political thing what you're talking about. Would Brinda like to respond to that?
No, I think so. I was going to say exactly that that text and many others before this, right? Delhi University, the syllabus often gets this attention, is very political. It's because of, it seems quite certain that it's not so much to do with the representation of Draupadi unclothed, which is what they said at the end, but really what political color Mahachitra Devi comes from, and they think that the syllabus has also come from, right? So those are possibly more obvious. It falls under the state ban in some sense because it's coming from above and it's being imposed. But it's not even for the actual obscenity, I think, which is what you were saying, right? That we don't know what is being seen as obscene, apart from an exposure of a woman's body, but a very distressed woman, and so she's not in any sexual situation in the text, and yet so those are all these outside factors, which is nothing really to do with sexuality at all, but it's using as Meena says, obscenity as a ruse in some sense.
I think,
also.
Brinda, the question is also, who is it obscene for? I think that's the more important question today. Who is it obscene for? Is it obscene for the state, or is it obscene for the academic community? As far as the second question of how do we combat this is a difficult question. I think students, teachers, people who are within the academia should put up, rally together and put up a resistance. That's the only way we can combat it. But then I also believe that things do not have to be part of canonized syllabi. You can nevertheless continue to teach it, even if the state or even if the powers who are there say that we can't teach it. So that is where the classroom becomes a space of dissidence, of freedom of dissent. So I think every teacher, every student can convert the classroom to that kind of a political resistance.
And in fact, not just the classroom, we've done this before, because DU has had, so many problems over the years, it was the science fair. So one of the things that we often used to do is have reading groups and workshops literally on the corridors of the department when things were banned or when you were not being allowed, some seminar has not been allowed, so we will then have it outside. So I think these are of course more kind of demonstrative ways of resisting, but I think we have to keep doing that, because I think the bans and they're just being taken for granted in lots of ways, and it's not just on sexuality. Here we're talking about sexual dissidence, but in every which way it keeps closing in, right? And yes, I think students and faculty should actually hit back. We tend to often just get exhausted. I think that's what they're also hoping for, that they will exhaust people into, how many times are you going to come out and have a reading group? Okay, you'll have it about Draupadi, then they'll ban something else, and then how many? But we have to, I think, just keep that alive and in some way.
I just had a quick point, which is that very often obscenity is seen to be a function of social authenticity, cultural authenticity. So whatever is seen as, and it's linked very much to tradition. So whatever is seen as, socially acceptable, or the social line that is drawn, anything beyond that is considered to be obscene. But there is one very interesting judgment in which, Justice Lenton, he was a dissenting judge in a case on cinema, actually, on a film. And he, in his dissenting note, he said what is obscene is not the sexual part of it. What is obscene is the degradation of women. And there you have a very important reversal of the traditional way in which obscenity is actually considered, arrived at, and sort of thought of.
Good afternoon. I wanted to know your thoughts on something. It's undeniable that our discipline has had a significant role to play when it comes to queer research in India. But unfortunately, when a queer person is approached, even by a researcher, and I say even by a researcher, the the questions posed to that person are more as if that person were a subject without any emotions rather than a human being. The questions are more often than not, they are asked without any consideration as to what that person will feel when being asked such direct questions. That too with little knowledge as to how many people or which people get to read the responses to the questions that are given. And so I wanted to know if you felt that there is a need for sensitizing researchers, especially who are doing their work in the realm of queer studies.
That's to you, Brinda.
I don't know. Do you want to take?
That's an interesting question, Roy. I was thinking, and it's something that I've always talked about in my classes, that every researcher also has to realize that there is a political position he or she or they embody. So the politicality of the research vis-a-vis the position that the researcher has with regard to the research is something that we fail to talk about in our research methodology classes. Because I think out and out the necessity of knowing that it's an intensely political activity that we are part of, and the researcher, the position that the researchers adopt vis-a-vis the study that the person is conducting, I think it should be part of what we teach as research methodology. The second thing is dissidence itself as an analytic category. How do we approach dissidence? How do we approach, that is where maybe that earlier point that I made with regard to a pedagogy of difference becomes so important. So maybe that's one way of solving the issue that you're pointing out.
I was also thinking that there should be, and I think universities may have it, but there should be ethics committees. And an ethics committee actually is there to ensure many of these, many of the problems that you're raising actually don't exist. So I think there needs to be proper training, particularly when it comes to field work and when the human subjects involved. Proper training as to how these subjects will be approached and what the levels of privacy and coding of information so that there is complete anonymization and so on and so forth. So I think what you're raising because I've done some very sensitive research and I think that there is just not enough attention paid to these matters which are absolutely crucial to the subjects of research.
But the problem is also that ethics committees and like internal complaints committees, often embody the anxieties of the moral majorities. So that's what happens. Yeah, that's something that.
But we need it anyway.
We need it.
We need it anyway. I think there's a question.
Yeah, there was a question.
Basically, I just want to share my experience as a researcher. And since we are talking about the academics and so I worked for about 12 to 13 years on surrogacy. And initially when I started, I wrote a project proposal about family and I came to India from Germany and I did my field work. I went back to give a presentation at Switzerland. And at that time we had I was a senior research associate, although I was, I obtained funding for my project. There was we had a head who was an anthropologist and he's from France. So we had a presentation, and for the presentation I had to send my section of work to him, slides to him. And he said, can we have some photographs of surrogate mothers? So I had photographs of surrogate mothers, obviously, wearing clothes like the surrogate mothers. But he said, no, it needs to be something sensational. And I couldn't understand what kind of photos he wanted. And then I recalled that when I was working in the field, the surrogate mothers used to run away, hide somewhere when BBC comes with the camera or photography comes with the camera. This is exactly the reason why I realized confused. I said, because I don't have any photos. If you want to put it, you put it in your presentation. I will not put it in my presentation. So basically, coming down to the objectification of women as because for me, my research, I was looking at these women not just as bones. They're not just bones, they have their own personalities, they have their own individualities. And the racialized body, how because they belong to a certain race and because these cameras had easy access inside the survey homes, they didn't have access. This could not be done in any other, Canadian survey mothers or Australian survey mothers. So these survey mothers had lesser rights and they had easy access to their bodies. So these are all imagery objectification of surveys of the heritage. So I just want to share this with you.
Thank you. Thank you, Sheila. That's a question that maybe I would ask Pramod and Anna also. Do you have a human subjects research ethics committee, or is there something?
We do have something called an institutional ethics committee at the university level, but that's because primarily anthropology journals from abroad want you to write a statement to the effect that A, there is no conflict of interest, 2, that it has been approved by the institutional ethics committee. Except that from the last 2 or 3 notices that have come, the assumption is these are to do with medical topics, not necessarily anthropological or sociological. So its slant is primarily towards medical ethics, bodies and subjects. Doesn't that? But I may not be entirely accurate. But this is what I sensed from the last 2 or 3 circulars that came. That if you are applying for funding to do with medical subjects, it requires institutional ethics board clearance. I am not sure that it applies to people working in, say, gender studies field work, such as the one Sheila spoke about, surrogacy, and maybe it has to do with things like tissue transfers and stuff. But whether it has an anthropological, sociological angle, I'm not sure. Sheila, do you remember what it says?
I think for the project that I got, I have to send it to everyone. So, see, but the thing is, we anticipate something like this. Sometimes as researchers, we have to use our own sensitivity. So we should be equipped with methodology and ethics in your research and study and teaching, so that you are equipped to then deal with situations like this and mention it. Because we, in certain universities abroad, you have it. You have an ethical clearance, but you also have it during the course of your research. So in the middle of the research also, if you have made any changes to the methodology or if you have any ethical concerns, you go back to the ethical committee and say that this is a concern that I'm facing, so how would I address it? And I think end of the project you also have to
yeah, that's what I thought. Because a couple of years back when I went abroad to do research, I had to sign on a form on human subjects research ethics. I didn't have to go to any committee, but I needed to sign on the form, and also when I came back, that I had not violated any of the norms.
A couple of years ago, at one workshop on research and publications, I had a component in my talk about informed consent and whether we have taken informed consent as having told them what it means to have them interviews, or as Sheila pointed out, photographs taken and what it will be used for. And one subcomponent of that was when dealing with subjects such as dementia, you cannot take the informed consent of the subject himself or herself. In that case, what is the mechanism? As in, who do you approach to take informed consent on behalf of? I was struck by the fact that nobody in the audience, which consisted of both social sciences and humanities, nobody wondered why I was talking about it. So this point that all three of you made about sensitization, which Roy was also pointing to, it simply has not crossed the collective academic mind. That informed consent must be built into, I think that's what Sheila was getting at, into the methodology itself. And in cases where informed consent is not possible from the subject herself, who do you approach for that consent? How do you document it? There are things like verbal postmortems now as part of methodology, where you speak to people, survivors of those who have died. And there's a whole set of prescriptive norms as to how the verbal postmortem, that's the term, has to be done, which is again about the point that Roy has, I think, triggered. I don't know whether we have clear-cut guidelines. Like I said, I'm going to be coming completely to my non-existent hat. Whether we do have all of it laid down by law. But I'm sure that it's not part of the methodology that I'm aware of here. As in, it's not part of the methodology that training imparted to students. Social sciences, Sheila will have to speak about. Humanities, I can say it's not. I know one case which shall remain unnamed, where one PhD researcher from English interviewed women of a particular community. It became part of a PhD, it became part of a book. The book does not carry any statements that informed consent was taken, and that the women interviewed were told what this was to be used for. Whether it was anonymized as part of this, or whether it was just a quantitative exercise as to we had a control group of so many. The PhD, to the best of my knowledge, also doesn't have any such statements, nor does the published version, which means also that the publisher didn't ask for it. So it's not just academia, but the structures within which academia functions also it doesn't seem to have this as part of the methodological understanding.
No, I mean, it's such an important discussion, but there is, to the best of my knowledge, and Pramod's already said there is nothing in place for the humanities. There is no such requirement, but if you are going, as Sheila did, abroad, then it's an absolute necessity that you have to put all of these documents in place and abide by the requirements. So there is dire need for ethics committees, sensible ones, and norms, ethical norms to be drawn up about how human subject research is to be done.
I also, since if there are questions, fine, but otherwise I just want to make a point. Are there any questions? I was also trying to respond to what Brinda was talking about with regard to censorship. And I was thinking about how there are social and cultural censorships of different kinds when it comes to writing. So there's a whole body of writing that we call confessional in Indian writing in English. I have a great issue with that term. Why should we call it confessional? When confession is also means that we're confessing some kind of a sin that we have committed. Why do we continue to talk about it in the 21st century as confessional mode of writing? Again, so I just want to give you an instance again of censorship. Till Malayalis got a confession from Kamala Das that her autobiography was fictional, we did not rest in peace. We had to wring that confession out of her. And once she said that it was fictional, we were all very happy. But there is also a certain kind of a play that the writer engages with, which is very interesting. But then the cultural sanctions, as Pramod rightly said, the publishing houses are also deeply implicated within that. Say for example, the year of publication, the place of publication. I have an article on Kamala Das where I looked at my story and Ende Katha, two texts, one in Malayalam and the other in English. What I found very interesting was that, in the 1976 Sterling edition from New Delhi, She has some absolutely wonderful titles. I too tried being an infomaniac. I tried adultery for a while. Good women of Nayak families do not talk about sex. Sex and the non-cooperative movement. These are some of the titles. Now, very interestingly, when the same book was published in 2006 by DC Books from Kottayam, these titles are all changed. I was an infomaniac becomes matrilineal Tharavad. The title becomes matrilineal Tharavad, I too tried adultery for a while becomes the village school. So look at the way in which there are other kinds of censorship happening all around us. This happens in the larger society, within publishing houses, as also in the classrooms. That's what I'm saying. So, within pedagogical methods, within the classroom discussions, and in publishing houses, in the date and time and place of publication, all these, at different levels, these kinds of censorship are happening when it comes to dissidence, I think sexual dissidence. Yeah.
That's interesting because these are writers of fiction. By definition, they invent, they lie for a living.
Yeah.
Why do we assume their confessions are true? So why should
the whole category.
No, I find the ironies of this genre itself interesting. And then we say, Kurt Vonnegut or Amish said this in an interview. What he has been saying all his life is lies. By definition, fiction being lying. And then the confession is taken to be true.
Yeah.
All their interviews. But their entire job has been to invent personae, characters, all sorts of hideous plots. But their confessions are somehow taken to be authentic and true, and we swear by what the fiction writer said in his or her interview. Yeah. And then we build theses upon theses. Because I've seen people citing the interview as this is the authentic insight into the author's mind. When considering the author's mind has been so murky for the last 40 years, inventing plots, and then we say, but in the interview this author said this, so therefore it must be true. We are not been able to make the distinction between the fiction author who creates characters and the fiction author who creates a character of herself or himself. And the confession, which is where the conflict that is genre itself is, isn't it? I mean, it's non-fictional, not confessional. But perhaps the emphasis should be on the con. So, it takes from the confessional poetry format of the modernists.
Yeah, that's it. I was just going to say that it comes from that whole Anne Sexton and that whole form of confessional poetry. Who are the ones who are writing confessional poetry now?
The way confession is taught in Indian contexts. I think it's sacrosanct.
There
are no more questions. Then should we call it a day?
Alright, if there are no more questions, comments, okay, one more.
Question. Maybe I was just thinking, one of the questions in the beginning was how do we write about how sexual dissidence you do? And I was thinking of this thought in Indian English. I was thinking of Mandir and one of his stories, Bose, where throughout the story you have a narrative sexualizing Mose, and talks about how she has large breasts and how she dresses inappropriately and how she puts too much color on her face, and at the end you have her naked body, which she has made naked for entire reasons of her own that have nothing to do with sex. I was thinking of how this is also a form of sexual dissidence, right? Desexualizing something that's usually considered to be hypersexual.
Yes, excellent. I mean that is, and it's seen so much in vernacular writing. I think even more. In fact, there's been so much talk. We were talking last night, right? That who are the Indian English writers who actually, inscribed sexual dissidence, and there isn't a huge now we were thinking of Khushwant Singh, for example, who was known as the one who wrote about sexual excess and dissidence. But at large, I think, in the main, I don't think there
Now
are.
I think it's starting now. Yeah.
But that whole,
Yes.
generation that wrote till
Yeah.
the current, Amitabh Ghosh, etc. I mean, there was not much of sexual dissidence, maybe a little bit here and there. But, yeah. Yes.
So I was also thinking about this whole idea of sexual dissidence, especially with respect to young adult literature. Like, how do we think of something like sex or even sexual dissidence in young adult literature, which is always steeped in a culture of censorship? So, do you talk about that?
Which is something that I said in my response, right? Because I said that those are kinds, we ought to include other kinds of writings into the larger canon that we're talking about. I think I mentioned that.
Yeah, she's talking specifically about young adult fiction.
Also introducing it to the reader specifically of that particular age group, because that is what the primary definition entails, right? When we are talking of the young adult literature, right? Books which are read by young adults first and foremost. So, how do we then introduce concepts like these to people of that age?
They actually know. A lot of it is, I think there's a lot of knowledge, there's a lot of information available. The question is really the source. And I think that, this question I started with, what is the problem in writing about it? It's really something that we have to apply our minds to and figure out. If it is going to be written about, how is it to be written about? So, for instance, Aranya, one of the writers whom I refer to, she says that she's completely against the commodification of sex. And she's very explicitly sexual and erotic and very, very explicit in her writing. And she goes on to, do two things. One is to point out what is wrong with commodifying sex, in her opinion, and the ways in which writing about sex need not be a sort of exploitative act. So I think, when we are able to acquire the necessary maturity to actually discuss these topics openly and sensibly, and to arrive at actually some kind of understanding about, what kind of sexual content, which really in some ways depends on, what kind of subject you have in mind, what you're thinking about. I'm not recommending a censorship or any kind of normativity here, but I think to be clear, to just be clear that about how you want to think about sex and why in that particular way.
If you're talking about not, someone of course can have an opinion about not commodifying sex, but do you mean in terms of prostitution, sex work, or is it pornography, or in what way would?
She means the complete objectification of people in order to monetize it. Which could also, I suppose, by extent, she's only talking about representational domain.
Right, so pornography,
but
monetize in what way? In terms of selling the books better.
But maybe.
But
no,
that's problematic, no?
Sure.
Then you're also setting certain limits on, how you might write about sex. Which one might want, but if I'm going to prescribe something, then that might become a problem.
It's a really tough one, because, are you, is it going to be, there is nothing like a level playing field. So is it going to be?
But sex is
sort
not a
of-
level playing field.
No, it's not.
Yeah, so we will have to either, allow
So
for
either it's
all
going
the
to be-
excesses or
I don't
not.
know. I mean, it's like
Or maybe another way of asking that. Sorry.
I have a slightly different take on that.
Yeah, sure.
I think that since when I say it's not a level playing field, I don't mean the realm of the sexual alone. I mean the representation.
No,
of realm.
representation. Yes.
Yeah,
that's
it's
what
not.
I'm saying.
It's not a level playing field, and so you might have now, even while the adjudicators, in a sense, might be themselves problematic, unless you make provision for voices that don't get heard to get heard. I think you're not going to be able to generate dissidence.
I think
That is-
maybe another way of looking at
Yeah.
it, Gabriel, not to answer your question, but to maybe look at it from a different perspective. Who is the young adult? I mean, I teach classes of students who are 22 or 24, and there is a certain kind of a tendency to infantilize our classes, our students. We begin from the premise that they are all asexual beings, They are not entitled to sexuality. They are not entitled to sexual difference. They are not entitled to dreams and desires of any kind. I don't know, maybe this is very specific to Kerala, but I don't know how it is in other parts of the country. But this is something that I have a huge problem with, because PhD scholars, 23, 24, totally asexual, you infantilize them, they are chaperoned to conference venues. So how do you begin to talk about who is the young adult is the question.
Though the category has an age which is kind of late teenage, right?
Yeah.
Young adult would be about 14,
I think from
15,
13.
12 to 18.
12 to
Yeah,
18,
yeah,
exactly.
12.
Exactly. So it's actually
Yeah,
pre-university in that sense. Yeah.
Not that Meena's argument still doesn't continue to hold, because there's a huge amount of information out there for the young adult between 12 and 18. But I just not responding to you, but just putting out another point there that either representation impacts us or it doesn't. You can't have it both ways, in my opinion. If you say that representation determines to some extent the way in which we understand the world and look at the world and so on, then you have to facilitate different kinds of representation. But and that's where I think that it's like an affirmative action, if you like, in the domain of representation.
So we have children's literature but no young adults literature.
Why not?
I mean, that is what is happening. Where do we find young adult literature?
You don't have, no?
You don't have, that's a point.
You don't have, or you do have?
We don't have, I don't know.
Okay, in Indian
I think
writing.
there is a
There
category
is-
though
there-
that
there is young adult.
We don't have much of it.
Like Indian young adult, as far as I know,
It's very little.
there's very limited.
We're generally comfortable with children's literature but not.
I think that a lot of the young,
Borrowed from
yeah,
the
it's
yeah,
borrowed.
that's right.
I think you have that whole Twilight and the other.
But then again, there kind of also, I was also kind of thinking like, if there is an excess of information, right, and there is always the teenagers who are, and that is kind of the time when you always go to seek out and try to break free from your boundaries, because it's always a very censored time and age. So, but then again, there do arises cases like the Bose locker room that was what coming to my mind, where there is a misuse of information as well. So, I mean, how do we kind of negotiate between this whole idea of what they want to know versus how do we censor what is important, like responsible censorship, if that don't make sense? It's just
Again, so for example, sex education in schools. There was a huge furore in Kerala when we tried to bring that in. So it speaks volumes, right?
It's actually been banned. They banned sex education, this current government. It was introduced and now they've banned it, so So people actually go to porn sites or other ways of getting their information.
Alright. Very quick, very short question.
Okay, so in one sentence, I was thinking about the role of humor in this age of censorship. So when you talk about stand-up comedy and other source of humor, and censorship is going on and on, so where is the prospect of humor when, or is it possible to elicit humor without offending people? Without offending people?
Offending people. No, because stand-up comedy or humor is actually based on offense of some kind, right? So no, you can't. But I think those censorships will never hold after a point, because people are bouncing back. A lot of stand-up comedians who were censored are back in Ante. So I think there's a water finding its own level business also going on somewhere.
But the jokes around sexual dissidence is again something that we need to think about.
Alright, I think I'm going to come and call it a day right now and ask you to all out tea. Thank you.
Thanks.
To repeat what Meena said, and in slightly different words, a big thank you to Professor Meena Pillai, Professor Brinda Bose, and Professor Gabriel for that wonderful exchange of ideas, provocations, comments, responses, everything. Thank you to Pramod sir and Dr. Sheila for those interventions.